So welcome everybody to another cyber webinar. Glad to have you all here. We're doing it a little bit at a different time of the day than usual. So I'm glad to see we still have some really good attendance going on here and some new faces as well. So welcome if you've never attended one of our webinars before. Thanks for joining us, and welcome if you have attended some prior ones in the past. Then welcome back. I'm glad to have you. It's great to have you. So today we're going to be talking about a topic that I think is going to be a lot of fun, which is quote unquote what hackers know about your AWS accounts. And there's a hint there, it's not nothing. So this is something that, I'll let Daniel talk about it more because he was part of creating the tool. He created the tool that we'll be discussing today. And so I don't want to take away his thunder, but the main reason I wanted to put together this webinar is because when I first came across the tool that we'll be introducing here in a moment, it kind of shocked me how much information it was able to gather about my own accounts. I knew a lot of that information was guessable or public information or things like that, but it's one thing to know that, it's another to actually see it. And so as soon as I saw that, I'm like, I've got to reach out to Daniel. We need to set something up. And so I'm very pleased and happy that Daniel was able to join us today. I appreciate you taking the time. So a couple of things before we dive in here and get started that I want to talk about. The first is going to be today's agenda. So kind of breaking it down into exactly what we'll be discussing. And also right before that, it's answering a couple of common questions. The first one being that, yes, this is going to be recorded. Yes, we will be sharing this and making it available for replay. So if you want to go back through it and watch it a second time, or if you want to share it with colleagues and friends, etc., or even on social media, feel free to do that. What I'll do is, typically I used to email it directly to you after the fact. I'm going to switch it up a little bit because that's actually the way the software works. Is it's quite a bit of extra work on my end. So instead, I'm going to be posting it on the website, the exact place that you registered to be here today, where there was that form. I'm going to replace that form with the replay. So give me about 24, 48 hours. After that, I'll have the recording for you. If you cannot find it, just ping me on LinkedIn or Discord, and I'll be happy to send it over to you. But what we're going to be talking about today is, first of all, doing a quick introduction. So I'll do a quick introduction about myself, and then I'll hand it over to Daniel so he can introduce himself as well. And then after that, we'll dive into what you're all here to talk about, at least I think, which is what can threat actors actually see inside of your accounts. And so we'll be doing some background context information, and then we'll actually jump into the tool and take a look at that. And really, the main reason to even be discussing a tool like this is to try and figure out how we can use this information to our benefit. So how can we use this to put on our red teamer hat and use it to pass it on to the defensive team and try to figure out how we can just better secure our AWS environments as a result of knowing about this information. And then also, just based on Daniel's background, I kind of wanted to ask him some questions regarding AWS security challenges that organizations struggle with the most. I get to hear some of that from my own customers, but Daniel and his employer also focus quite a bit on that. And so I'd love to get some insights on that I think will also benefit us as listeners as well. So that's kind of the main high level agenda of what we're going to be talking about today. And like I said, I think this is going to be a lot of fun and a lot of good back and forth conversation. So as we go through, what I would like for you to do as a listener, as a viewer, is to ask us questions. You don't have to wait until the very end. I know we say we've got 15 minutes at the end for Q&A, but really I like to sprinkle the questions throughout. So as we're talking about stuff, if you have a question, there should be a Q&A tab in the webinar software. It's towards the top, at least for me, it's towards the top left. So you can click on that and you can just submit your question, pass it on, and Daniel and I will monitor those questions and then address them as they come up, or we may hold some towards the very end as well. So yeah, with that out of the way, we'll get started with introductions, Daniel, and then after that, I'll hand over screen sharing to you and you can take from there. But I'll start with myself. Hi, I'm Christoph Limpelaer. I'm the founder and trainer at cybr.com, where we teach AWS security. So we really help you build AWS security expertise. And that comes from many years of AWS production experience on my end, but I also work with other authors who also have many years of AWS production experience in various topics. And so we work together on creating high quality training material that you can then take back on the job and apply directly. A little bit more about my personal self instead of just work self. I'm originally from France, which is where the strange name comes from, but I currently reside in Denver, Colorado. And as you can see from the picture, I love hiking and skiing. So if you're ever in the area for a conference or something like that, please hit me up and we can maybe go on a hike or grab a coffee or something like that. I'm also a professional hobbyist. So when I'm not doing AWS security or creating training material, I've got a few different hobbies. I'm currently sort of trying to learn how to fly. And that's very early stages, though. I'm also a home brewer, so I like to make homemade beer. And prior to that, I used to grow mushrooms. So that's always a good conversation starter there. If you'd like to follow me or connect with me, there's my LinkedIn address in the bottom left corner. And Cyber also has a Discord community where you get to collaborate, ask questions with people who are interested in cloud security as well. So if you want to join us there, it's at cyber.com/Discord. But with that, Daniel, take it over.
All right. I'll just do my intro and then I'll screen share after. Hi, I'm Daniel. I'm a super serious internet guy. I like to play fast and loose with my words and my blog posts, and hope that I don't offend anyone. So that's why I say that. I also like to poke fun at almost everything. So please don't take me too seriously. I'm a Milo enthusiast. For those that haven't tried Milo, it's that bright green can on the right there. It's a malt drink that Australians and Southeast Asians love. I'm trying to pressure Nestle into giving me a sponsorship, so that's why I continue to bring it up. But probably more relevant to this conversation is I'm a hacker of AWS stuff. I've been hacking AWS since 2016. I wrote the first end-to-end hacking framework for AWS. I've published a number of tools and papers and conference talks. So that's where my background has come from. And finally, I'm Chief Innovation Officer at a company called Clarion, which is a cloud security platform that you can get a free trial of at clarion.com. And as part of that, if you like the kind of stuff that I say and I cover, I run a free mailing list on awssecuritydigest.com, which anyone can subscribe to. And basically on a weekly basis, I go over all of the news and research that's been published and say some super serious stuff about it. So that's me.
And actually, I think I take back what I said earlier. I'm pretty sure that's how I first discovered you, because I am subscribed to the Security Digest newsletter. And I remember when you took it over. So I take back what I said earlier. That's when I first discovered you, and then Awseye came out, and then the rest is history. So definitely recommend the newsletter if you're not yet subscribed. I'm a personal subscriber of it, and it's free to subscribe to. So really good stuff you've got there. Perfect. So I'm going to stop screen sharing, and that way you can start taking that over. The responsibility is off my shoulders. No more pressure.
Let's do it. Okay. Share screen. I hope I don't screw this up. It should be sharing right now. Christoph, you can tell me if that's working.
You go. Yep.
All right. So before telling you about what hackers know about your AWS accounts, I just wanted to dive into why should you even care to begin with? Because it's kind of fun information, but beyond that, you kind of want to know why it's important. And so I want to start with this sort of half truth that we've been telling you, the makers of cloud security platforms have been telling you. Because what we give you generally is a list of all the stuff that's broken. For example, the canonical example in AWS is you've got all these open S3 buckets. Oh no, everything's good, the world's ending. Someone could download all the stuff from your bucket. But the thing that we don't really say is someone's got to know that the bucket exists, right? So if a bucket is a really long random string, how's anyone going to find that bucket, even if it is open to the world? It's kind of like a session ID, if it's a long and random string, someone's got to find it somehow or guess it somehow to be able to use it. And so there's this kind of disconnect between what a hacker actually has to do versus what we tell you is really broken. And that was the origin of why Awseye came about. And Awseye is the tool that we'll be discussing. Okay. So before AWS came along, or before clouds came along, the way that you would hack something, a company, for example, is you'd go and find their IP range, and you'd scan all the IP addresses with Nmap and Nessus and whatever. Like, just you'd find all the hosts that were up, or you'd run a brute force DNS crawler to find all the host names for that company and see if they were up, and then you'd start hacking on those things. So sort of prior to the cloud, the thing that, and the prerequisite for an attacker was a host name or an IP address. Now that's still the case. That's still how you hack, right? But also in the cloud, like, those things aren't important because, well, some of them are a little bit important, but there's additional stuff because all the resources are behind an API. And so what matters more is when you call the API is how do you address those resources? So less about IP addresses and host names, although they still matter, and more about other things like in AWS, it's ARNs and resource IDs and things like that. And you need those, or like I already mentioned, DS3 bucket name is the thing that you need. And that's actually behind an API, even though it looks like it isn't. So I'll give you some examples of like how you would go about hacking something in AWS that's non-traditional. So the first one is SQS. And SQS is the simple queuing service in AWS. And so the idea is you make a queue, you put stuff on it, something else, a consumer comes back and takes stuff off it. Now, like a cloud security tool will tell you, okay, that's been made public. That's really bad because someone could write to that queue or read from that queue, so that's horrible. But like when you're attacking it, what does an attacker have to actually know? And how would they find a queue that exists like this that's been made public? And the way that they would do it is to build this URL. And the reason why you would build this URL is because that's how the API is addressed, right? Like you actually make a call to the Amazon AWS SQS API endpoint with a region inside it. So that's that first line of the URL. And then you have to pass it an account ID. So in which account does this queue live? And then you need the name of the queue. So like you've got to find these things, these three elements somehow. So the regions are easy, right? Because the regions are well known. You just go to the AWS website and they'll tell you all the regions in AWS. Now the account ID, that's getting a little bit tricky. It's like, how do you find that? There's some lists available on the internet that you can look at, but how would you find a company's account ID? And that's a real problem. And then you have to guess or somehow identify that a queue exists. So you might say, oh, well, that's easy. There are a few queue names like in and out might be some good queue names that people use. But what if they use something complicated and random, like I said before? How are you going to find that thing? And you need that in order to write and read to and from that queue. By the way, jump in if anyone has any questions at any time. Please do jump in. Otherwise, I'll just be talking. And I don't know what I'm missing. So another example of how you might hack AWS stuff is this cool bit of research on shadow resources done by I think it's the Aqua security team last year. Now, this is really, really cool. And the idea here is that there are services in Amazon that when you first start using them, when you first sort of bootstrap them, they create certain resources for you by default. So they can put bits of data in there. For example, one of those resources is CDK. So CDK is like Amazon's version of infrastructure as code. And in order to maintain the state of like what's been spun up and what's been spun down and how things have changed over time, when you first start using CDK, AWS, the client, creates this bucket for you that looks like this: CDK dash some random string. Then there's a few of them it creates, but one of them is CFN exec role. and that's a static string. And then again, you see you need the account ID and the region. Now, why am I telling you this? Because if one of these buckets is public, or between doing the bootstrap and running the client, you delete the bucket and someone else creates that same bucket with that same name, they can start putting CloudFormation in that bucket. And when you run CDK next, you'll be running their CloudFormation, or they'll be running your CloudFormation, not their own. And so an attacker can use this to sort of like take over your whole AWS account. But it's all predicated on this ability to predict this bucket name and find a bucket that's either doesn't exist with this name or is writable with this name. But it's so going back to the prerequisites and what you need, that random looking string, you might say, well, that's really hard to guess, Daniel. But alas, it turns out it isn't, because that is the default string that obviously no one ever changes, or very, very a tiny proportion of people ever change. And so that's actually, that shouldn't be a variable. Like, we should take the braces away from that string because everyone uses the same one. So that's easily predictable. And so now you're down to, what do I need to know? I need to know the target's account ID and the region. And again, the region is super predictable. Okay. So those are a couple of examples. There's heaps of examples. Like this is not a webinar on hacking AWS, but like the things that you might need in AWS are account IDs. We've talked about those. IAM keys. People know these things. Like a lot of hacking incidents on AWS actually come from the fact that someone's accidentally put their key in secret on GitHub, or they've rolled it into their package that they've published to NPM or something. So IAM keys, Amazon host names. So some things in AWS, the API is actually addressed by a host name rather than something outside of the host name like an ID. But it still calls an API, it's just the API sort of consumes the host name. There's resource IDs. So if you spin up a VPC, for example, the VPC will be VPC dash some long random string. That's an ID. And in order to do anything with that VPC, like tear it down, add to it, whatever, you need that ID. There's resource names. We've already seen an example of that. The queue name is an example of a resource name. And then there's these things called ARNs, which are sort of an amalgamation of a lot of these things, which is the long, unique Amazon string that should identify each resource in Amazon. So those are the things that hackers need to like, and the developers need to just talk to the AWS API. Which begs the question, how do attackers, or anyone for that matter, how do they find these kinds of things? And so I'll give you a bit of a demo now. So I'll stop sharing this screen, I think.
And this is a good time to ask questions if you were holding off on doing that. I'll keep monitoring to see if anything comes in.
Sure. Share screen. Okay, here we go. Let's share that entire window. Okay, so this is a tool called SourceGraph. And SourceGraph is, the way I understand, is basically a search tool for various types of code. So you can integrate it with your own repositories. But what the lovely folks at SourceGraph have also done is started a public instance of SourceGraph, which indexes all of the biggest public GitHub repositories. So if you ever want to search GitHub for something and like the GitHub search API isn't kind of like giving you what you want, or you're hitting rate limits or whatever, SourceGraph is a good place to look. And so what's happening here is it's actually taking a regular expression here where you can search for something across all of these repositories. And the regular expression that I've used here is an ARN, so this string, with any 12-digit number, so a 12-digit number being an account ID, and then a role. And so here I'm looking for, and the results show all of the various places in public repositories in GitHub where an ARN like that exists. And so I'm trying to find, in this case, I can see both account numbers, like this one in ArangoDB, and also the role names, which is the resource name. And so you can basically type, you can do the same thing for users, any kind of regular expression that you want. You can search GitHub with SourceGraph for these kinds of things, which is really handy. It's like a really, really handy way to do it. It doesn't give you all of the results in all of the public repos in GitHub. If you wanted to do that, then you need to consume something called the GitHub Events API, which is just a fire hose of all of the pushes that go to GitHub to public repositories in real time. But it's massive, and you hit rate limits really fast, and you need lots of compute to be able to consume this thing. So that's one approach that attackers and researchers have been using forever. Another approach is all the registries where for languages where people put their packages. So think PyPy, NuGet, npm. I don't know. Christoph, what other ones can you think of?
For what kind of data sources are you referring to in this case?
Just any for any language, the packages that they use, like the libraries that people publish for those. Go has one.
Like you can even go to like the package.json and go through that. I was actually going to ask you about in the source graph where you're using that regex, how have you found that works in comparison to even just Google dorking, like going in there and trying to search for a pattern like that in Google, which will obviously scrape that information from GitHub. So maybe you can bypass some of those restrictions, but it probably doesn't give you all the results. Like, have you compared and seen how much data that returns in comparison to that?
Yeah. So I have tried it. So there's a few barriers to doing it with Google. One is like you need lots of results. And so what you actually need is a reliable API, search API for Google, where you can go through thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of results. And that's a bit tricky. You like doing it native, trying to code it natively through Google, you get stopped for various reasons. If you use a third-party service, you've got to pay for it, and it's not cheap. You do get a different set of results. For example, one of the things that's really cool to find is to find vendor documentation where they specify, like they'll have a PDF with all of their information about their accounts and how they structure resource names and stuff. That's really good because you can attribute it to that vendor, right? Whereas like if you get some random result off the internet or off GitHub, you don't really know who it belongs to. Is it a cloned repo? Like, why did they put it in there? You don't know. So you just get different sets of results with the approaches.
And we're talking about very different things here because obviously if you're targeting a specific organization with a specific account ID or at least a set of account IDs, that's a much smaller result set. But when you're just trying to scan wide swaths, that's a whole different scale to consider. Yeah, wow, that's interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And so you bring up a really important point that I was going to mention later. There's kind of like two types of hacking in the cloud or in general. One is like I have a target in mind. Maybe I'm a bug bounty hunter or something, and so I'm going to go after that target only. The other type, which is maybe I'm a security researcher or I'm just a actor who like I'm not too concerned about what the target is as long as I get someone valuable. And then you try and like hack everything. You just try and like it's like scanning the internet for an open database. Like maybe if I find a couple, one of them will be super valuable, and then I'll go compromise that. And so, like yeah, doing the targeted thing is much harder, definitely in the cloud. And one of the reasons is finding someone's account ID is actually a tough bit, or finding an account ID and then attributing it back to the owner is actually really tough. And so you're far better off trying to get all the data and maybe getting it attributed when you kind of like you find it in this GitHub repo or in this document or whatever, and then working the other way when you need it. That's like kind of like the bigger approach.
And someone mentioned PyTest as another option as well, or another source. It's a good one.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, there's heaps. Like, I've even looked at plugin repositories for like IDEs for various types of products. Like people, wherever you put programmatic like information or any information that might be related to AWS could be a really good resource. Like I imagine those repositories that store presentations, like PDF files and PowerPoint files, they might be a really good place to find AWS IDs. I haven't done that yet, but people always not always, but sometimes overshare when they're doing a presentation or whatever. But yeah, anywhere like notes, those public notes sites where you can just type in stuff and save it to yourself or send it to a mate. Like all of these places are opportunities to look for these kinds of identifiers. But if you're an individual, like you're not going to do that. Like you don't have time for that kind of thing. If you're an organization, you're not going to do internet scale reconnaissance of everything just to get that one nugget about yourself. It's just a waste of time. You've got more important problems. And so that's where I come in. Which is the next slide, which will just go straight to trying Aussie. Am I still sharing my screen? Okay, so this is Aussie. I know it looks like it says AWSI, but that's wrong. That's madness. That would be a mistake to call it that. It's actually called Aussie after my home country. And so basically, a lot of the stuff that we just talked about, I'm doing it. It's happening right now. It's scanning those registries. It's looking at GitHub. It's looking all over the internet, and it's putting the data in a giant database. So what you can see down here, down the bottom, is Aussie has indexed 341,000 AWS accounts. It's found 3.1 million resources, and then it's found 17 million mentions. So mentions are a little bit different. They're like somewhere on the internet, someone has mentioned a resource. So the same resource might be mentioned in thousands of different places on the internet. And so they're all indexed in Aussie. And what you can do in Aussie is you can just come in, type in any account ID. I'm going to use the surprise me button, which I'll explain in a second. And it'll tell you what it knows about that account. Now, the surprise me feature is kind of cool. It's not actually a random account. It's a random account in a subset of accounts called well-known vendor accounts. So there's a couple of folks on the internet who have put together these giant lists of well-known vendor accounts. They got them from PDFs and other places. And they also have attribution to who those accounts belong to because they came from documentation. And so I use those. If you click surprise me, it'll actually open up one of those accounts for you and show you what it knows about them. So if you just want to get a feel for the tool and you don't want to yet put in your account ID, that's totally fine. You can try this and you can see this particular account belongs to Qualys CloudView. It has a bunch of roles in it, all of these roles, like stuff like an SNS role. So now we know this account probably uses SNS, probably uses EMR, probably has some databases in it, all of these kinds of things. This one in particular has lots of roles and has a user called administrator inside it as well. But yeah, you can do this with your own accounts, or you can use the surprise me button. One thing I will say, I just want to explain what actually happens when you type in an account ID. If Aussie doesn't know about the account ID right now, what actually happened is it doesn't return an empty set of results, or it might the first time. But in the background, what's actually happening is it's saying, what can I find out about this account, even though it hasn't been mentioned anywhere on the internet yet? And then it sort of like does this enumeration process in the background. And what does it enumerate? Well, now we're getting into the bit about what can hackers find out about your AWS account. there's a bunch of enumerations that can actually happen if an attacker has your AWS account. One of them is all the principals. So roles, groups, and users. If they have guessable names, like say root or administrator or EMR role, like the ones we saw below, or AWS Elastic Beanstalk service role, all of these are kind of like well-known role names that can be sort of predicted and used. So it has a massive word list, and it actually tries to see does this role exist in this account? Does this one exist? Does this one exist? And it's able to do that because there's a trick with the policy engine in AWS where if you try to create an IAM policy with a principal that doesn't exist, it won't let you. It says no, it gives you an error. And if you can create that policy with a role that does exist, it'll succeed. And so you can use that mechanism to validate whether these roles exist, whether these users exist in an account. Another thing it does is all of the queues. Again, all it actually takes to validate whether a queue exists is to go to that URL that we described below. And if it exists, it'll give you one type of response. If it exists, but you don't have permissions, it'll give you another type of response. And if it doesn't exist, it'll give you yet another kind of response. And so we're able to enumerate stuff doing that. So that's just a few examples of what it does. So it does that enumeration, and it'll come back and show you all of the things that an attacker can find out just with your account ID. And one of the cool things here is like these role names are not just role names in that you can infer a whole bunch of stuff. So for example, if you read the Splunk documentation or the Splunk Cloud documentation, and you want to integrate your AWS with Splunk Cloud or Datadog or whatever, what they will often do is like describe how you should set up this integration. When one of the things that they do is tell you, hey, use this role name for the integration. And so, okay, if that role name exists, what you can be somewhat certain of now is that that company uses Splunk or Datadog or whoever else, or Clarion, for example. Which, as an attacker, like, sure, you might not be able to do anything with that role directly, probably has good permissions on it, but now you know this company uses Splunk Cloud. And so you've got this, like, you're building up this set of information that you can use to then attack the company through other means. And so I actually find this really cool. Going back to the very first point we started this conversation with is most people think that, like, your account ID, probably no one will be able to find it. But even if they can, like, my account is behind an API, like no one can log into my account, so they can't see my resources. Well, turns out they can enumerate a whole bunch of these resources. They can also find mentions of those resources on the internet. And if they do, the attackers have been like indexing this data for a long period of time. And what I'm doing is giving you access to be able to, like, get a sense of what an attacker could see about your account, because you're not going to be able to do this indexing yourself.
Multiple questions. Let's see. And hopefully some come through as well. But you read my mind and you started explaining one of the questions I had, which is, for example, I've gone through and I've submitted my own account ID or one of my account IDs, and it discovered different roles, mostly different roles, at least in that one. So what you're saying, if I got it right, is initially, if it doesn't already have the account ID in the database, it will go and it will check and see, using the policy trick, whether that role exists by trying to add it to a policy. But this happened really, really fast. I don't remember sitting there waiting with the spinner going for a minute, right? So are you telling me behind the scenes, you're literally running APIs that are just quickly checking, am I getting access denied, or is it working? Is it creating the policy? Is it not, et cetera, like really fast, and then spitting out that response and saying, okay, this role exists because it let me create the policy. Is that right?
Yeah, so that's absolutely correct. The only thing I would say is really fast is a matter of, like, is a relative matter. So to complete an Aussie enumeration usually takes, I don't know, let me call it 5-10 minutes. There are people who have perfected these techniques, and they can do much bigger scale, much faster. So they could probably do an account in like 2 or 3 seconds because they can scale this thing out. I have a responsibility to sort of AWS and my employer to do this in a kind of ethical manner. But the point you make stands. And I'll just add one more thing, and that's like all of these things are happening all the time. Like while I'm sleeping, it's running all these things. For example, one of the other things it does is, okay, account IDs are 12-digit numbers, right? And you might say, well, as long as I don't publish my 12-digit number somewhere, no one will ever know. But in the background, it's doing big checks of big blocks of account ID space to see if there's any valid ones. If it finds a valid one, it does the enumeration process on it.
So eventually you'll have every single account ID mapped out. I don't know how long that takes. Well, we can ask Claude real quick, but eventually you're going to have everything mapped out, right?
That's the idea. Yeah, exactly.
I don't remember it taking 5 to 10 minutes. So either my memory is failing me, or perhaps the account ID was already in your database, which is entirely possible because I don't particularly hide my account IDs. If you go through my training, you've probably seen dozens of them. So it's possible that somebody's already gone through and either posted it in a write-up for a guide or something like that, and maybe you found it that way. Is that right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, possibly. Maybe
Okay.
you put it in a GitHub repo, or maybe someone
Yeah.
internet. Maybe it found it by accident using that block space thing. Who knows?
Okay, cool. So that was question number 1. Question number 2, just out of curiosity, and you don't have to share if some of this is private, but what kind of database are you running this with?
It's Dynamo in the background.
Dynamo. So you're running okay, you're running Dynamo. What are some of the other technologies that you don't mind sharing with us that are powering this?
It's all the stuff you would expect on AWS. It's like API gateway, Lambda, Fargate. There's some EC2 instances doing some of the heavy lifting and some of the like ad hoc researching and grinding of lists that you have to do. DynamoDB, SQS, SNS, that kind of stuff.
Do you have, because I know you write a lot of blogs and you have the newsletter, do you have some articles or resources that you can share with us where you explain some of these enumeration techniques where maybe I have not heard of one before, like the SQS giving different responses is a clever one that I don't think I was familiar with that before. So do you have an area that you can send us that shares more of that?
Yeah, so actually, when we did the announcement of this, we published a blog, What Do Hackers Know About Your AWS Account? And in there's actually a bunch of links listed to some of these techniques. So there's the SQS one is right here, your queues, your responsibility. But there's a whole bunch of others, and yeah, they're all linked. There's honestly, like, part of the trick of Awseye is over the years, there's this like knowledge that has been built up, and it isn't necessarily kept in one place. There's a good resource called Hacking the Cloud, run by Nick Frechette, which he attempts to kind of like put all this knowledge in the one place, but there's just so much of this like random quirks and things that like you can't get in any one spot. And I tried to put some of them in the blog. Nick's tried to put them in Hacking the Cloud. But honestly, you just kind of like have to go through years of years and years of blogs and GitHub repos to find them all.
You're probably getting to that point, so I might be rushing you here, but do you mind showing us all the types of resources that are potentially enumerable through this? Because that was one of my next questions I had when I first started using this. I'm sure others are curious as well. It's a lot. It's a lot more than I would have thought, to be completely honest with you. I did not realize some of these would be able to be guessed or figured out in this way.
Yeah, so the enumerable ones are actually pretty limited as far as I know. So it's principles, queues, and buckets. There might be a couple of others that I haven't yet discovered. But basically any resource that can be mentioned, that can be written down in code, can be discovered in some way. So that's why we have this list of resources here. I hope you can see my screen, that can be discovered. For example, one of the things I haven't mentioned is that some AWS API calls actually return all of the public resources of that type. So if you make a EC2 image, disk image public, there's actually a call that you can make, which is show me in the world all the public images. And so you can get all of those IDs directly from AWS as an example. And so, yeah, here, if you go to this list of resources, you can click one of these things. You can see all the latest buckets that have been discovered. You can see, look, this one is actually an Athena query results bucket for this account in this region. There's some generic named ones. One of the cool things you can do is if you find a public S3 bucket, you can actually get the account ID from that S3 bucket by using some neat policy tricks. And so again, you can discover, you find a public bucket, maybe it's hosting someone's website, you can now get their account ID and their org ID, and then you can enumerate stuff from there.
I just launched a hands-on lab on this. It's based on the research by, I was trying to find his name so I could share it here. It's by the CloudR team, Ben Britz. And so this is a free hands-on lab. If you have a free account on Cyber, you can go through it. And that's exactly what Daniel was just talking about. It uses another very nifty trick that I would have never come up with on my own that reduces it from trying to make millions and millions of attempts to just about 120 requests. So it's really cool. Definitely recommend checking that out if you haven't already.
So Ben did the initial research of this on S3 buckets. I then extended this research and made a tool called Conditional Love that not only works on buckets, but works on a variety of other resources, and not only finds the account ID, but can find other things like the values of tags, the org ID, etc. So if you like, have a look for Conditional Love in GitHub, and you'll find that, and you'll be able to do that for yourself.
Did not know about this. I will definitely be checking this out. Maybe adding another lab for it.
Exactly. This is one of it's years and years of just hacking AWS comes in handy. Okay, let's move on. So what does it all mean? Okay, you're surprised that there's this data about your AWS account. I would be too. It's just a weird thing to see, but you're not hacked, right? Just because someone knows a resource exists doesn't mean they can hack it. This is a really important point. But what it does mean is they can now attempt to do stuff to that resource, attempt to hack it. Now they know it exists. So now they know you have it's the equivalent of having an IP address. They can go start poking at it and seeing what's there. And so I think of it as, if you find a resource like this that is enumerable, you should probably go look at that resource, especially if you think it might be public unintentionally, and just go check. Hey, is it meant to be public? No, yes. I need to fix that right away. You might have thought previously, hey, no one can guess this thing. Now they can, so just go look at it and go fix it. You're not hacked, but you could be hacked if the resource is misconfigured. So better to be safe and just go check it. Basically, that's how I think about this. That's for the end user. There are other use cases for Awseye. One of the really good use cases is for people like me to do broad scale internet research. Previously, you would have to type in lots of queries to Sourcegraph, or use the GitHub search API or whatever. But now you can just use this database to find things like this, because there are always new techniques popping up of hey, what if a role is exposed and I can hack it? Or what if it's got the wrong permissions coming from GitHub? Can I assume it by abusing GitHub to assume the role? All of these kinds of things. And then one thing I wanted to share is how, I wonder if can people still see this slide?
Yes. There we go. It took a second, but there we go.
Okay. By extension, how can people use this information and why does it matter? So for example, going back to the lie that I said we were all telling about resources and exposed resources is that like you got to know they exist. Like what we've done is integrated into our platform, or we are integrating into our platform. So it's that an additional bit of information that will tell you, hey, your resource, your S3 bucket is misconfigured. It's not empty, has confidential data in it. The objects are publicly listable, but also it's appeared in Aussie, so someone can probably find it. And so it's not that that piece of information on its own is like super useful, but when you add it up and you're trying to figure out, okay, like I have 10 minutes to do some work. What's the really important work that I need to do? It's just another layer of like prioritization information that you can add, and that's what we're using it for inside the Plarion product.
As a piggyback off of that, let's say they're not a Plarion customer. How do you typically see organizations fitting this into their workflow? I think I saw something about getting an API key or something on your homepage. So I'm assuming they'd be able to feed that into another tool they have and try and corroborate those. Is that typically how they do it?
Yeah, exactly. So the API, I would say there's a bunch of people using the API, but we're still working on how we're going to productize it and commercialize it. So people can just email data at Awseye.com and like tell us what they want to use the API for, and chances are we'll just give them an API key. And so yeah, then they can integrate it. There's a number of things people have used that for. They're integrating into their Splunk, for example, to see if like to match up with, hey, some weird activities happening, plus also it's in Aussie, plus whatever else. And so it gives them more richer information. Bug bounty hunters are using the information when they're hacking on programs. Threat intel companies are using it to enrich their threat intel, etc. So yeah, people do a variety of things with it, and we're trying to discover all of those use cases so then we can actually match the API to the use cases and make it really powerful.
Sense. Thank you.
Of course. And so I think that's mostly it in terms of Aussie and how it works. Yeah, I think you've seen most of it. You can click on all of the resource types and find them and see what's available, and you know, have a play with that information. I guess the next bit of the conversation was more about challenges with AWS security. So I've got one slide which we can work off, or I can let the group or yourself ask questions.
Yeah, I was going to say, if you have questions, folks, go ahead and submit them. I think everybody's awestruck because I was expecting more questions, but we don't have that many coming in yet. I think everybody's as awestruck as I am. I've got a couple more questions. I'll probably hold them to the end, or if it ties into what we're talking about here. But I guess as a segue into it, kind of piggybacking off of what I was just asking of, how do you, talking more about that workflow, like what are some of the main issues organizations that you work with tend to have, or struggles that they have, and how do they use something like Aussie to feed into the rest of their tools, and what can those tools then tell them about, like, hey, if you have this S3 bucket, it's in Aussie, so everybody can know about it, and it may be misconfigured. How do you figure out that it's misconfigured? And then from there, how do you fix that misconfiguration and move forward? How do you typically see that workflow?
Yeah, so the first two challenges that I listed on my slide were knowing what you have, so like asset inventory. I'll park that to the side for a second. Knowing what it means and then prioritizing the work. Those are two big challenges that pretty much every organization of any size, but pretty much anyone who's not a startup is facing. And so there's this, whenever you start doing cloud security, no matter which tool you're using or which cloud you're using, what inevitably happens is you just get a huge list of stuff, right? Everyone runs into this problem. And then they're like, what do I do with this 10,000 findings? Whether it's vulnerabilities or misconfigurations or like informational stuff or I don't know, attack paths, whatever fancy stuff tools are doing these days. Like, what do you do with it all? Like, which, one tool says this thing is important, another one says this other thing is important. Like, my team's like trying to build my startup, or they have a project they need to complete, but then project managers yelling at them to do this security thing. Like, why do I need to do it? Like, that's the crux of it. And I think that's where Awseye comes into play as one of the signals that lets you better prioritize and understand if it's a real problem. Or like if that S3 bucket is public, but there's no way to guess the name, maybe you have a little bit more time than if it's an S3 bucket and the name is guessable, or it's in Awseye already and you can see it. Another example maybe is if you're getting some like a detection that some weird activity is going on across your account. If those resources are in Awseye, maybe you have a much better signal that, hey, I should look at this, rather than, hey, it's just some random thing that like always happens in the account and I don't have time to look at it. So it's just like moving things slightly up and down the list. And if you have a lot of these signals, like Awseye is one of them, but if you have a lot more detail about what's going on in your AWS accounts, then you can make better decisions about where to prioritize. And ideally, the person doing the work isn't doing that prioritization. Ideally, there's some tooling that's saying, hey, I've done the hard work and analysis for you. Here's the priority list. It's not 10,000 things. It's these 13 things, and you should do them in this order that I tell you.
I like that. And I think it could also end up being if you've got that access to the API, or you're subscribed to it, or you're monitoring changes for your specific account IDs, for example, and you end up getting pinged that a resource has been discovered, and you're like, wait a minute, I thought that would have never been discovered before. Did we make the Lambda function public accidentally? Like, what? Did we misconfigure something? You can find out about it before somebody else does, where it might otherwise catch you off guard. And I've definitely been there before, where I thought something, maybe a document on Dropbox or whatever, was private, and then a year later somehow I come across it on Google or something, and I'm like, oh crap, that's public. Whoa, hold on. So I could definitely see that translating to AWS resources as well in some cases.
Yeah, I would say by extension, one of the big things I've seen, so I've been a sizer at various companies. One of the problems you get into is like, if your company's been around for any length of time, let's say more than 2 years, people have come and gone from the company. You've started with a stack that looked one way, and you've built components that have changed, and then you've changed approaches, changed languages, you've started building new things, right? And then people have come and gone, and new projects have come and gone. And so like the organizational knowledge and understanding about the AWS environment or any cloud environment has drifted from what is actually in there. So I would go, in previous employers, I would go ask the engineers, hey, how many DynamoDB databases do we have? Or what does our production infrastructure look like? How many S3 buckets do we have? And they would give me one answer. And that answer would be some version of what they've been around to see, plus what they can remember, plus maybe some stuff on the edge going, maybe one someone said something about this, so there's probably one of these things. And then obviously that's, if you get some kind of inventory that actually goes and looks at what are all the things in there, it's inevitably, it's going to be vastly different than what the engineer has told you. And so like, that's why this understanding what you have is really important. And Awseye is one way to get an understanding of what you have, because like people have come and gone and all that stuff. And there's just stuff in there that you don't know had existed, and maybe public stuff, exposed stuff that you don't know existed. And again, Awseye is one way to find that.
So we got a couple questions that just came in here, and then we're going to start running out of time. So if you have a question, now is the last opportunity to do so. I definitely recommend doing so. The first question was, this person wanted to know if Awseye can only see their public resources about their AWS account without authentication to AWS. So I think what that's asking is, I think what that's asking is whether it's only able to run unauthenticated, like it's not a tool that's going to go through and authenticate into your account and then run an inventory of all that as well, or in addition. I think that's how I'm interpreting it. If you're interpreting it differently, please let me know.
So correct. Aussie never authenticates into your account. Some of the enumeration techniques that it uses are completely unauthenticated, and some of them require authentication into AWS. So, like trying to hit an S3 bucket with a web call, you can do that unauthenticated, right? It's just a curl request that you run. But running describe EC2 images that are public, Aussie has to be authenticated into AWS, not into your account, but into AWS to make that call. But yeah, we never ask you to allow Aussie to be inside your account.
It's not a CSPM. It's not meant to be able to go in and give you a complete inventory of all those resources. It's definitely more of that OSINT external unauthenticated view into the account, which both play a very important role for sure. Good question.
So I think about it as outside in rather than inside out.
The second question was, is the AWS account ID or knowing the AWS account ID mandatory for Aussie to check security issues?
So again, it doesn't really check security issues. One of the things it finds is maybe a resource is exposed or not. So it can flag for certain types of resources. It can flag whether a resource is exposed. It doesn't need an account ID to find some types of resources, but some it does. So for example, like if it's mentioned anywhere on the internet that Aussie looks, then it'll be found because it's mentioned, right? But some things don't need an account ID. So S3 buckets have a global namespace, and your bucket could be called, I don't know, blah. And it might be able to find that because it checks a word list of things, and it doesn't have your account ID. Some other type of resource might need an account ID to find it. So it just depends on the resource type.
As another example, I just pull it up here. If you go to Lambda function URLs on Aussie as one of the sources, it will dump out all of these different domain names that are related to AWS Lambda functions. And then it will put the account if it knows the account, but there's a column where it says unknown for account. So in that case, it doesn't even necessarily know which account it belongs to because it doesn't have that account ID, but they were still able to figure out what that Lambda function URL was. It can also tell you whether it's active and whether it's exposed. Real quick, what does that exposed flag mean?
So if you can make a request to that resource to do something. So in the case of Lambda URL, if you curl it, it'll either come up with a HTTP 200 response and show you something, or it'll say 403, you're not allowed to view this.
Gotcha. So if it's 403, it'll say false, otherwise true, and then there's also that unknown where maybe it's not able to determine.
Exactly.
Awesome, cool. I want to be respectful of your time, so that's why I'm kind of rushing here at the end because it's been an hour, and I really appreciate you taking the time to do this. This was super insightful. I could keep asking you more questions. We could go on for a couple more hours, but I want to respect your time. So if people have further questions they want to follow up with here, what's the best way to reach out?
Probably just on LinkedIn or Twitter, or is X. But I'm on Twitter, DAGRZ. But LinkedIn is usually good. I generally accept everyone's invites. So come say hi. And yeah, I'll respond.
Don't forget to also check out his newsletter. Don't forget to check out those blog articles. They're really valuable. They have a ton of useful information in there. And then, check out Plarion as well. Check out Aussie. Let me know if you have some feedback. Hopefully this was an insightful and helpful webinar for you guys. If it was, please also share that feedback. Maybe we can try to schedule more stuff like this and potentially have Daniel back on maybe in a few months to talk more about AWS hacking and other such things. So thanks everybody for attending today. Daniel, any last minute things you want to mention?
No, it was super fun. I'd love to do it again sometime.
I'm glad. It's always more enjoyable for everybody when the guests are or when the presenters are having fun as well. So thank you for doing that. And yep, there's the link he just shared, awssecurity.just.com. Check it out. It's completely free. Otherwise, thanks everybody. Have a good day or good evening, and we'll see you in the next webinar. Bye, doggo. I forgot to ask, what's the doggo's name real quick before we hop off?
Her name's Lulu.
Bye, Lulu. Thanks for attending the webinar. All right. See everybody later. Bye-bye.